I had an opportunity to speak with a friend about how to understand the words of Jesus in Scripture in relation to all the other passages of Scripture that are out there. You know, why do some Bibles use red text for the words of Jesus? Are they more sacred? Are they more authoritative? How do we think about this? A lot of good questions in that. I think you'll get a lot out of this. So check out his ministry when you have the chance, Red Letter Basics. Okay, let's dive into it.
So why are the words of Jesus important? I think this is a question that is kind of a central issue with Red Letter Basics, because it's the very principle of starting with the words of Jesus.
It's a really remarkable thing, first off, to think about how God himself became flesh and lived among us and spoke among us. You know, you have that moment when at the transfiguration of Jesus, and God says, hey, this is my son, listen to him. Like, of all the things that God could say, the voice of God from heaven speaks forth an audible voice, and he says, listen to this guy.
Yeah.
And he's pointing to Jesus, and it makes sense in many ways, because Jesus is God. He is fully and completely God in every kind of way. And so when he speaks, God speaks. Jesus makes this very clear about his divinity throughout the Gospels, and especially the Gospel of John, kind of near the end. But that's a really important thing. Now, kind of like what you mentioned, there is a confusion as to what that means when we look at the words of Jesus in comparison with the rest of Scripture. Because even the way kind of the idea of red letter, like some people might see the red letters and be like, oh, these are more important or more biblical or more divine than the rest of Scripture. That is not Christian theology at all. And some people will mistake that and start teaching those things, but that is wrong. What is significant about Jesus is that when we're looking particularly at the whole of the New Testament text, we understand that Jesus was what he did and what he said was very foundational.
You might even say the cornerstone.
To what came after, right? And so Paul and Peter and others are looking back to the life, ministry, death, resurrection of Jesus as they speak.
Yeah.
And so this doesn't mean that Jesus's words are necessarily like more authoritative as Scripture, but they do have a foundational role where the way that we make sense of the New Testament is by looking back at how this was built up from what Jesus did. So if we're going to start somewhere, start with Jesus.
Right. I think that I'll just go off of that because I was thinking of the imagery of a fulcrum, and Jesus is in the fulcrum. So either you have the Old Testament looking towards Jesus, or you have the New Testament, the epistles and all looking back to Jesus.
That's a really good image.
It's not like there's a new revelation.
It's like the truth of the Old Testament and the revelation of the New Testament kind of hinge on the reality of Christ, who he is as the Son of God, as the one who fulfilled the entire Old Testament and then set into motion the entire New Testament.
The fact that there's this foundational piece by a single speaker who is God himself, and the fact that we can go to this voice as a kind of foundational starting point for understanding how the rest of Scripture comes together. That in and of itself simplifies the task at hand. Because now we're not just taking all of these different verses and teachings from different authors of different periods of history and so forth, and trying to make sense of this. What we're doing is we're starting with Jesus, and here's what he says, and then that helps us make sense of what's going on around in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. I mean, that really is a kind of simplification of what might otherwise feel like a very daunting task when you open up this brick we call the Bible.